author of the book Israelophobia. Mike Buckley is director of the Independent Commission on UK-EU Relations and a former Labour activist. And Lord Daniel Moylan is a Conservative peer and former Deputy Chairman of Transport for London.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock. The Israeli army says an error was behind reports of a suspected airspace infiltration from Lebanon. Earlier, the north of the country was put on full alert with sirens blaring in large areas near the border. In the last hour, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has been speaking before boarding a flight to Israel.
We will be reaffirming the very strong message that President Biden has delivered to any country or any party that might try to take advantage of this situation. And that message is don't. The President has deployed, as you know, the world's largest aircraft carrier group to the region to make very clear our intent to deter anyone contemplating any further aggression against Israel.
Gaza's only power station said to have run out of fuel after Israel cut off energy supplies. Police forces across England and Wales will be asked to vote on whether they should have the right to go on strike. Officers are not currently allowed to take industrial action because they are Crown servants, not employees. And it's been confirmed a fire which led to the collapse of a car park at Luton Airport did start in a diesel car. Hundreds of flights were delayed and cancelled as a result. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 8 points at 76.20. The pound buys $1.23 and €1.15. LBC weather, cloudy with outbreaks of rain across England and Wales tonight. An overnight low of 0 in the northeast. Dry and sunny for the north tomorrow. Some showers in the northwest and the south with a high of 18 Celsius. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, welcome to Cross Question. It's 2 minutes past 8 on LBC. On our panel tonight, we have Jacqui Smith, chair of 2 NHS trusts. She's not satisfied with one. Former Labour Home Secretary and co-host of the For the Many podcast. Jake Wallis-Simons is making his debut on the programme. He's editor of the Jewish Chronicle and author of the book Israelophobia. Mike Buckley is another debutante. Is that the female debutante? I don't know. Anyway, director of the Independent Commission on UK-EU Relations and a former Labour advisor. And Lord Moylan, Daniel Moylan, Conservative peer and former Deputy Chairman of Transport for London. They're here to take your calls. 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850. Say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And of course, you know what I'm going to say next. You can watch us on Global Player.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to our first caller. It's Terry in Watford. Hello, Terry.
Hi, Iain. Hi, panel.
Hi.
My question is, can the panel define the word proportionate in respect of the Israeli response to the terrorist attack? Because I'm hearing politicians in this country use that word without defining what is acceptable and what is too much.
I think it's a brilliant question. I'm not sure it's a question anyone can answer, but let's have a go. Daniel Moylan.
Well, I would say that Israel, first of all, just to get out of the way, I mean, this is all absolutely terrible, and everybody has sympathy with the people who've suffered so much, the Israelis and other people living in Israel who've been attacked in this way, and it's absolutely appalling. And Israel, of course, has the right to defend itself against this sort of attack. There's no question at all about that. But the question of proportionality, it seems to me, does need definition, and the way to look at the definition is to see what is proportionate to that right that Israel has to defend itself. So what is necessary and proportionate to achieve that level of defence that it needs? Proportionate doesn't mean if they've been appalling, we can be appalling as well, just for the sake of it. The proportionality relates to Israel's legitimate right to defend itself from this sort of attack or any other sorts of attacks that might be launched against them.
But what's happening in Gaza at the moment I mean, people argue that isn't a form of defence, that is punitive retribution.
Well,
I don't argue that, but some people do.
People will no doubt say that, and I have given what I think is really quite a good formal definition. You then have to take that and apply it in reality to the facts that you see happening. And that is always going to be messy, difficult and complicated in any situation, but especially in a wartime situation like this. So some people will undoubtedly see what's happening in Gaza as being punitive, but it's very difficult to see also how Israel can take out the sort of administrative and other infrastructure which is being used as a basis for these attacks without some collateral damage also occurring. And these are very harsh things to say, and they sound almost unhuman, but this is exactly where the moral argument about the conduct of war takes place. It's in these harsh and difficult, edgy places. And I'm not saying I've got the answer to what has happened today, what's happened tomorrow, this particular attack, this particular raid, whatever. But those, I think, are the sorts of principles we need to be looking at. Is it proportionate and necessary for Israel to achieve its legitimate defence of itself from these attacks now and in the future?
Jacqui Smith, I can't really imagine you agreeing with Daniel on anything, and yet you were constantly nodding your head at what he was saying there.
I largely agree with what Daniel said, and I also agree with him about the complexity of the situation and, of course, the fast-moving nature of the situation. And just to be completely clear, I do agree with him that Israel has the right not only to defend itself, but to take action against the infrastructure that is used by Hamas and was the basis for their hideous attacks on Israel.
Even
and
when
it
that
has
includes
the right,
hospitals and schools?
Well, I'll come on to that in a moment. And they also have the right to, I believe, and I suspect may well happen, to enter Gaza in order to try to free and rescue their hostages and people who've been taken away. However, of course, over a period of time, you then get to a position where if you're not careful, you do potentially move into areas that I think international law would recognise as being disproportionate. The use of siege, for example, to try to pursue your military
Well, we've got another
aims.
question on that, so leave that to one side.
Okay, but that I think would become disproportionate over a period of time. For example, the indiscriminate targeting of civilians would be disproportionate. To come to your question, and this is what I think Daniel was saying about collateral damage, it is hard for us. What we can see is that what is happening in Gaza is disastrous for the Palestinian people. It is the destruction of their infrastructure and their lives. And, of course, that's what Hamas must have understood would have been the consequence of the action that they took. And I think this will be a very difficult period of time as we support Israel in their legitimate aims and their defence, whilst also recognising the need to prevent a humanitarian and military disaster for the Palestinian people in Gaza as well.
So reminder the question, how do you define proportionate in terms of military action? Jake, you've been writing about this, your journalist has been writing about this in the Jewish Chronicle over the last few days. Is this one of the main themes of some of the articles, of how to define what proportionate actually means?
It's certainly something that we think a lot about, and every person of conscience does think about that. The perspective that I come from, and every person that I know in the Jewish community and in Israel, and just generally people of good conscience, the perspective we come from is that every life is sacred and must be protected as far as humanly possible. That includes Palestinian civilian life, Israeli lives. Let's just get that out of the way. It sounds obvious, but it needs to be said right off the bat. Having said that, there can be no accommodation with the Islamic State. We didn't talk about proportionality when the RAF joined with a coalition of Western forces to destroy Islamic State. And what we've seen with Hamas is that although it has become known to people, particularly on certain branches of the left, as being a sort of revolutionary, almost like a Che Guevara of the Arabic world, the Israelis have always known the truth, and the world is now seeing the truth. Beheadings, rape of children, it was just announced this evening, grotesque mutilation of corpses and parading them through the streets, and the taking of Holocaust survivors, old people, children, as hostages, then using them, threatening them with execution and so on and so forth. There can be no accommodation.
Just on the beheadings, I've been getting lots of texts this evening saying there's no proof that this happened, and the IDF person who originally alleged this, according to a couple of texters, has now withdrawn it.
Well, this evening, as far as I understand it, just before I came into the studio, the Israeli Prime Minister's spokesman confirmed that it's true.
Okay.
So that's what we're dealing with, and I'm sort of building up towards the scenario. There are some untruths that are flying around about the situation with Gaza. The first is it's very common for the useful idiots of the jihadis of Hamas in the West to undermine Israel's security measures by painting them as an affront to social justice. For example, the idea of a sealed border as leading to an open-air concentration camp. Well, we saw over the last few days why that border has been sealed for so long, because if it wasn't, this would have happened a long time ago, and Hamas wouldn't have stopped at 1,200 people. It would have gone for 6 million, the same as the Nazis did. The other thing is that Gaza has not just one border, it has two. The other is with Egypt. Egypt is not opening its border. Egypt is not allowing refugees to come in to its territory. It's not behaving in the way that the Arab countries behaved when the Syrian war was happening, accepting refugees and helping them. It's not providing significant humanitarian aid.
Why is that?
Why is that? Because the Egyptian leader, al-Sisi, was asked about this just yesterday, and he basically said, we don't want to invite problems into our country. It's not our role to resolve somebody else's fight, somebody else's problem. That's part of it. It's complicated. And so you end up in a position where Israel is being called upon to feed, to provide with energy, to provide with water, and to enable its jihadi enemies while it's trying to destroy them. And I think that
I can understand that from the energy point of view, in electricity, fuel, whatever. It's slightly more difficult to explain to the ordinary Brit that denying Palestinian people food and water is sort of doing anything to aid the battle against Hamas.
I think it
could be the reverse.
I think it's a very, very difficult judgment to make sitting here in London. I think the scale of this doesn't sometimes hit home with people. The proportion. Israel is a very small country, has a population of smaller than London. If you scale it up to be a British population, it would be the equivalent of 8,500 deaths. If you scale it up to America, I believe it's about 45,000 deaths. This dwarfs 9/11 in terms of the Israeli experience, and it is existential, particularly with all eyes going north towards Hezbollah, which are a graver threat than Hamas. If they join in, we are then suddenly in a position where we're not far from thoughts of Israel's entire annihilation. And if we look back to how we behaved when we were last under existential threat in Britain, after 9/11, we went with the Americans into Iraq. And we all know about what happened there. But when we experienced existential threat on our own shores, the last time was really the Second World War. And just think of Dresden, firebombing indiscriminately millions of people, or hundreds of thousands of people. And so I think it's very easy for us to sit here in Britain and wag our fingers and say, oh no, proportionality, why don't you just be nicer and sing Kumbaya? Israel is dealing with ISIS. I mean, Hamas share a common ideological root and history with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They're dealing with that threat, and they are behaving according to the rules of warfare that they have set themselves, which are higher than most armies in the world adhere to, such as warning civilians to move away from targets before they hit them, with leaflets, with a dummy bomb on the top of roofs before they hit the building, with mass text messages to civilians. I agree with you, to cut off food and water feels harsh sitting here in London, but when it's total war and existential, it feels different.
Mike Buckley.
Lots to say. Lots to agree with from all sides. We've been listening today to Joseph Borrell was talking about civilians and, where humanitarian law, where international law draws the line, is at the point of where civilians are needlessly harmed or killed or maimed. And I think we've already gone way beyond that point. I mean, definitely more. We're already at the point where more Palestinian lives have been lost and more injuries have taken place within Gaza than within Israel, which is not in any way.
It's a tally.
Which is not in any way to justify the actions of Hamas. And I agree with you, there can be no accommodation with Hamas. I mean, they are a terrorist organisation. They are against the Jewish people entirely. They're against the state of Israel entirely. So there can be no accommodation. But that cannot mean and should not mean that every civilian life in Gaza is at risk. These people, I mean, as you say yourself, these people have got nowhere to go. You send them a text message, they're going to go somewhere, where they're going to go, probably somewhere else where they're going to get bombed.
But the problem is that if you take that view, that action against Gaza is because of the danger of civilians getting injured or killed. I mean, what should Israel do then? I mean, it can't just sit back and do nothing.
No, it can't. But, I mean, at the moment, we're in the midst of this crisis. We are in the midst of this moment. But if you take a step back, and I was pleased today particularly to read that some American lawmakers are beginning to take a step back and beginning to think about Israel-Palestine, two-state solution. There's been no move towards a two-state solution for decades, even though it's still talked about as, this is...
That is largely because of Hamas, isn't it?
It's not entirely because of Hamas.
I didn't say entirely, I said largely.
I wouldn't say largely. I would say it's just as much because of the Israeli government, which is busy, putting settlements across the West Bank in defiance of international law. It's also because of American politics and inaction of the American government. The only organisation in this world that can make a meaningful difference in this long-term conflict is the American government, and they have failed to since at least Camp David and Bill Clinton.
Well, John Kerry had quite a big initiative, didn't he? When he was Secretary of State under Obama, there was quite a lot of shuttle diplomacy then. It didn't actually amount to anything.
There was shuttle diplomacy, but there's no movement. And I think we all know pick an example in history where building a wall around something and incarcerating a group of people has ever been a long-term solution. Gaza, the wall around Gaza is not a long-term solution. You can encase those people, but eventually something will happen, and something has happened, and we all wish that it hadn't happened. But what we need to think about now is how do we prevent this from ever happening again? And that can't be just going in, doing lots of bombing, killing lots of people, taking lots of buildings down, taking away food and water, putting the wall back up and leaving it be. That cannot be the conclusion. OK, more questions from you in just a few moments' time here on Cross Question. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
And if you want to do that, you can tell us how brilliantly Jacqui Smith is doing in answering the questions, or not, as the case may be. Jake Wallis-Simons is here. He's the editor of the Jewish Chronicle. Mike Buckley is a director, or the director, I should say, of the Independent Commission on UK-EU Relations and a former Labour advisor. Just tell us in 30 seconds I suppose it does what it says on the tin.
That's what it says on the tin.
But what do you actually do?
Well, we look at the impact, sector by sector, not just at the economy, but also security and defence, health and social care, Northern Ireland, etc., of our departure from the EU. And then we propose changes to the agreement, which, if implemented, would improve outcomes.
OK. And Lord Moylan is here, Daniel Moylan, a Conservative member of the House of Lords. Let's go to a text question from James in Barnet. I read today that Jewish schools across the UK are having to increase security. To what extent will this conflict in the Middle East cause strife here in the UK? Jake.
Well, I think it already has. I mean, there is an increased security presence around Jewish schools and synagogues. In fact, it's some kids I've heard anecdotally are going to school and it's making them anxious, thinking what's going to happen to us, so we need to have these police outside. And hopefully they won't ever find out and it won't ever happen. My nephew was shouted at in the street yesterday. My sister was pursued by a car of people shouting at her as she picked up her toddler from nursery. This is real stuff. And I think that in the bigger picture, we saw a very large pro-Palestinian demonstration in London yesterday night. And there have been demonstrations in Brighton, in Manchester and elsewhere. And I should make clear that I am not saying that supporting the Palestinians is bad. They have a reasonable cause and it's perfectly reasonable and legitimate to support them. I'm not saying it's wrong to fly their flag. But what I am saying, firstly, that supporting Hamas is a criminal act because it's a proscribed terror organisation akin to ISIS, the point I made earlier. But secondly, if your first response to seeing the sorts of brutality and savagery that I talked about earlier, that we've all seen and read about, if your first response is to lift a Palestinian flag and say Free Palestine, even if you don't mention Hamas, that's how it feels, particularly to the Jewish community in Britain. And so I think that there's always a spiral of tension and hopefully not violence, but it tends to follow when events in the Middle East go the way they have, because anti-Semites here are emboldened by that.
Mike?
I mean, I agree with everything that you've just said, and I'm very glad that security procedures have been put in place at schools and other places where Jews gather, and we can hope that there will be no violent response, and there's already, as you say, been a rise in tension. This only gets resolved when we get peace in the Middle East. And if there's one outcome from this, it has to be renewed attention to this from all sides, from our own governments, from the US, from the EU. And without that, we will see this recur, and we will see tension recur, and we will see acts of violence here in Europe and other parts of the world where Jews live their lives. And that isn't to justify it, but it is to say that this all takes place in the context. These awful acts are very, very sadly not the first awful acts in the land of Israel and Palestine. And there is huge tension, and there is huge anger on both sides. And that isn't going to go away until people come together. And I know most people think that's impossible. But you
Would you have suggested peace talks with ISIS back then? We were fighting ISIS.
I am not including Hamas in this at all. You're right; they are a terror organisation, and they need to be rooted out. And I agree that there has been a lack of leadership.
The Palestinian Authority did support
side.
the terrorism as well over the past few days.
I'm sorry?
The Palestinian Authority did support the terrorism over the past few days, legitimised it as being resistance and actually agitating towards it as well from the West Bank.
There has been a gross lack of leadership from the Palestinians for many years, and that is indeed a part of the problem.
So how do you negotiate peace
with
these sorts of leaders?
You find people you can negotiate peace with.
Well, there was one called Nazir Banat, who was a democracy campaigner last year. He was a threat to the Palestinian leadership. He was kidnapped by the Palestinian security services and beaten to death.
Which is an awful act.
So how can Israel achieve peace? Where's the partner for peace?
I agree with you. It's very.
It sounds like cloud cuckoo land to me.
It's not. It can't be cloud cuckoo land.
I don't want it to be. I want peace. I'm just saying it sounds like it.
But you have to have someone to negotiate with, don't you? And I think that's what Jake's trying to say, in that there is, at the moment, nobody who can claim to represent the majority of Palestinian people to negotiate, or credibly to negotiate with.
That is true. Well, in that, if that person doesn't exist or that organisation doesn't exist, then maybe this needs to be done for the Palestinian people.
Done for them?
Because the conclusion still remains.
By whom?
Unless you get peace, you will get violence.
So it's negotiated for them by whom? I mean, who should speak for the Palestinians?
That isn't the key point here.
It sounds like forgive me. It sounds like cloud cookie hand.
Daniel?
And what we need is practical solutions.
Yeah, look, you've identified a real strategic problem, is that there isn't a quality leadership on the Palestinian side with whom peace can be negotiated. The question Mike is asking is, whose problem is that? And unless Israel recognises that it is actually Israel's problem, as much as it is the Palestinians' problem, then of course you'll just sit there saying, well, there's no one to talk to.
Why do you think Israel doesn't recognise that that's the problem?
Well, it recognises a problem, but you're not doing so around this table. You're saying there's no one to talk to, so who can we talk to? Now, that is your problem, not your answer. That's your difficulty. So what's your answer to the difficulty?
Well, my answer is, if you ask me what my answer is, I am very taken with the idea that came in with the last Israeli government, which is a very broad church and very pragmatic, of shrinking the conflict. I.e., we can't see necessarily a grand plan to get out to resolve peace in the Middle East right now. What we can do is maybe agree that we can maybe take a few checkpoints down, we can ease things here or there, we can find pragmatic solutions to ease the conflict and shrink the conflict and find consensus step by step to get to a position where peace talks are possible. As Naftali Bennett, the last Prime Minister who promoted this idea, put it, 70% of Israelis agree on 70% of the issues. And and I think that is a good way to approach peace in the Middle East. I think the idea of saying that we can just have a two-state solution and talk to them and all this business right now, when, as you admitted and acknowledged, there's no partner for peace. In fact, there's more terrorism in Gaza, but there's also in the West Bank. It's for the birds.
So to come back to the original question around security in schools and the situation in the UK, I mean, the terrible truth about this is that when I was Home Secretary, I worked with the Community Security Trust on security around Jewish schools, synagogues, Jewish cemeteries. There has been a long-term concern for Jewish people in the UK about the security risks that they face. And that has been worsened by some of what we've seen as a response to the last few days. And I think it is right, if slow, that the police now seem to have recognised that. I actually agree with the Home Secretary.
What?
I know, pretty unusual for me with her. But I do agree with her argument that at this moment in time, actually the police do need to take strong action against people who are creating further fear amongst Jewish people in the UK. And we have to be very careful that we don't do things, however strongly we feel about them, which put Jewish people who have family and others in Israel who feel desperately, as we've heard, who feel desperately worried and sad about what's happened, under further pressure from actions that we allow to happen.
Let's take a quick call before the news from Kamal in Harrow. Kamal, hi.
Hi, Ian. First-time caller. How are you?
Hi, welcome. What would you like to say?
Yeah. There's a lot that I want to say in the last few days. But obviously, first of all, can I just start with, it's absolutely awful. Any deaths on civilians, whether it's in Israel or in Gaza, West Bank, is awful. But we have to put it into context, and nobody's mentioned the elephant in the room here is that.
Kamal, when I said what would you like to say, I really meant what was your question, because we're slightly running out of time.
Sorry. Yeah. So my question was, where do we draw the line between free speech and hate speech? Because I do feel we're getting closer to reaching a point where any criticism of Israel will be criminalised. And I think that will be a travesty of justice.
Well, I would hope we could all agree on that. It's perfectly legitimate to criticise Israel. I mean, I've been very trenchant in my defence of what Israel has done over the past 48 hours, but in the past I've certainly criticised Israel and its Prime Minister for a lot of the things that they've done. I'm going to ask you all to answer that question briefly after we come back from the news headlines. It's 8:30. Let's go to Lottie Morley.
It's claimed an invasion of Gaza could happen as soon as tomorrow after Israel set up a war cabinet and government of national unity. Here in the UK, British Airways has suspended flights from the UK to Tel Aviv, with one having to turn back to Heathrow. Thousands of police officers in England and Wales are being asked to vote on whether they should have the right to strike. They're not currently allowed to because they're Crown servants rather than employees. And the Shadow Health Secretary has used his conference speech in Liverpool to say the NHS must modernise or die. Wes Streeting says there must be more emphasis on preventing illness and providing treatment in the community to relieve pressure on hospitals. LBC weather, cloudy with outbreaks of rain across England and Wales overnight, mild in the south but cold in the north with a low of 0.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
So Kamal's question was, where should we draw the line between free speech and hate speech? Is there space for criticism of Israel? Jacqui?
Well, of course there is space for criticism of the... I have frequently criticised the current Israeli government in more normal times than we're in at the moment. I think that I would not criticise the right of Israel to exist, but you can completely legitimately criticise the actions of a government. And I think that people who sort of claim that you can't are sometimes trying to make a slightly different point, frankly. But there's also a time for sensitivity, and it doesn't strike me that in the aftermath of the type of scale of hideous atrocity that the Israelis have experienced, that this is the right time to try to find a critique, notwithstanding the very important discussion that we had earlier on about proportionality. So there is a timing issue here, and there is a precisely what is it you want to criticise. It's wholly legitimate to criticise a government. It's not legitimate to criticise the existence of a country.
Mike?
I would agree with everything that has just been said, and now is absolutely a time for sensitivity. I have criticised the Israeli government many times in the past. I used to be an aid worker, lived and worked in the Middle East, been to Gaza in different times, now is not the time to criticise Israel. Now is the time to support Israel. Now is the time to question the actions of the Israeli government that they are taking in Gaza. And in coming days and weeks, we will need to have a broader conversation about why did this happen? How did this get to this point? What is the future of Gaza? What is the future of the Palestinian people? How do we move towards peace? But it's now maybe the right time to begin that conversation, but very graciously and very cautiously, in a way that there are lots of incredibly grieving but also incredibly terrified Jewish people out there.
Daniel?
I'm going to fall out with everybody here. I've always thought the whole notion of hate speech was legally flawed and should never have been introduced. And I think the more we see it roll out in practice, the more difficulties it creates. And it's all very well, Jacqui and I, we can criticise the government of Israel because we know the right words to use if we want to criticise them, and we can do it, and we'll listen to. But apart from biting on extremists, which there are laws that would work already to do that, the people who get caught out by hate speech in this country are actually working class people normally, very often white working class people, trying to express views that they don't know the right code words to use in order to make their point. They're the ones that Mr. Plod comes round and knocks on their door. Never come round to Jacqui or me. Get rid of it. Get rid of the whole idea.
That's quite a good defence of the position, Jacqui.
Well, I'm not.
It's your government that introduced all of this.
If you're broadening, what you're essentially saying is that there could never be a crime that was inciting hate against people on the basis of their sex or their race. I just disagree.
You've got crimes for incitement for murder. You've got crimes for incitement to violence. These have existed for decades, centuries before you introduced the notion of hate speech. But the fact is, you've extended it to a point where it now covers a whole.
I don't find this a country in which people find it difficult to express their views. I don't find that. But what I do want to do is to live in a country which is tolerant, where the law reflects that, and where we don't expect people to incite hatred against other people on the basis of a whole range of different characteristics. I don't think that's repressive to want to live in a country like that.
Jake?
Well, my perspective wouldn't necessarily be to dwell on the legal definitions or legal enforcement, but more the moral question. And from my point of view, it is totally fine to criticise Israel. I criticise Israel myself. In fact, in Israel, there is more criticism of Israel, it sometimes seems, than outside Israel. Totally fine.
A bit like Britain, then.
A bit like Britain, but louder. But what I would point out is that sometimes criticism of Israel becomes a Trojan horse for something darker. And if I might mention my book with your permission.
Please do. I should have mentioned it more often myself.
It's called Israelophobia. And that is my word for the newest version of the oldest hatred. And when criticism becomes something else, it tips over into Israelophobia, and there are hallmarks of that. It begins to articulate lies, such as Israel, for example, perpetrating a genocide when the Palestinian population has increased fivefold since its birth. Patent lie. It begins to articulate lies like Israel is a white supremacist state where more Israelis are non-white than are white, and apartheid and so on and so forth. But it also demonizes Israel, criticizing it for the smallest infractions and magnifying that out of all proportion while ignoring the far greater sins of the countries in the region and around the world. And when it begins to articulate the sorts of language of medieval anti-Semitism, calling, in the old days they called Jews bloodthirsty and bloodsuckers, but now you can call Zionists bloodthirsty and bloodsuckers. You can deny the legitimate right of Israel to exist in the same way that people try to deny Jewish people the right to exist. There's this very clear overlap, and it has a historical precedent. But when criticism of Israel becomes, as I said, a Trojan horse or a ventriloquist's dummy for that sort of rhetoric that's thinly disguised, then I think it is morally wrong.
Right, let's move on to a different subject. Dan is in Boreham Wood. Dan, what would you like to ask?
Hi, it's hard to word, but it's a question on essentially the balance of Keir Starmer's pledges on housing and how, he's a Labour politician, he needs to stay to his roots. But in the past, Labour politicians have been all about, regulation, and then taxing the public to then build homes. And what is he really going to do? Is he going to bulldoze planning? Is he going to be novel with some novel ideas about encouraging private, how do we encourage people to build homes? What is he really going to do?
Well, I'm afraid he isn't here, but the next best thing is sitting to my left, Jacqui Smith.
Well, I'm not here to explain Keir Starmer's housing policies.
Well, yeah,
However, I will say that I think he was. Well, first of all, he was pretty clear, and Labour has been pretty clear in defining what the problem is here. Far fewer young people can own their homes and have decent places to live in than was previously the case. So there's a problem that needs to be addressed. There are insufficient houses being built, and there's too much bureaucracy standing in the way of the development of housing in any sort of at any sort of level that will enable us to solve those problems of where people are going to live. So you have to reform the sort of proposals he was putting forward this week involved reforming the planning system, strengthening the ability of councils to have expectations about what proportion of housing will be affordable, for example, and how developers will fund other social developments. And something that I, having been a former MP for Redditch, Newtown, was quite sort of pricked up my ears at, the idea that you will actually allocate areas where you can build new towns, which of course was what happened in the 1970s with the Newtown Commission, in order to provide affordable housing outside cities for people. Those all seem like sensible ways of solving the fundamental problem, which is my kids and lots of other people's kids are going to find and are finding it enormously difficult to get and to buy a house. That is surely something that all of us want to be able to aspire to.
Daniel Moylan.
Well, let me start by congratulating Keir Starmer on gripping an issue and making a credible case when the Conservative Party, I'm afraid, has gone into retreat. So I broadly applaud the tone of what he said, but then look into the detail and you'll see that his numbers are the numbers that were in the 29 Conservative manifesto. So his pitch is basically, we will do what the Conservatives promised they'd do, nothing radical, we'll just do what the Conservatives promised they'd do and haven't lived up to. It's good, but it's not actually a radical Labour policy. Then we look at, what is this? I like the idea of new towns and a new town commission, but whether you can get that past human rights law nowadays in the way that you could in the post-war period is another question.
Why does human rights law come into
because this? You're going to have to take land. To make it work, you were able in the old days to take land at agricultural values. And nowadays, the value, of course, of the land would go up the moment you designated it as being for a new town, and that creates property rights that engage the equality. I don't know what the legal answer would be. It hasn't gone to court, but it engages an argument about property rights. But let's see if he can do that, because I think he should be able to. But then what I really want to say is that the big problem nowadays, there is bureaucracy, of course there is, and there's NIMBYism, as you mentioned. The big conflict nowadays is between environmental regulations and house building, and I chair the Built Environment Select Committee in the House of Lords, and we've just done a wonderful report exploring all of this, and I encourage you to read it. But what happened when, the government came forward in the House of Lords a few weeks ago with the plan for breaking the current logjam, which is this sudden arrival from nowhere of a new interpretation of a European law judgment on something called nutrient neutrality, which has put a block on house building in a very large part of the country. And we were trying to reverse it. Labour whipped the peers, their members in the House of Lords, to vote against it. So in the end, Starmer is going to have to address the one thing, the big thing he avoided on housing, which is more important, all those blades of grass and the flowers and the birds and the bees, or a place for you to live. And that he ducked completely, for understandable reasons. But he's going to have to confront that very quickly, and probably within the next couple of months, because I suspect the government is going to come back, I think they've indicated, with a new bill which will enact that, and they'll be challenged again to vote for it.
Mike Buckley.
I think it's an incredibly radical policy. For decades, politicians have ducked the need to build houses in this country, and have ducked the fact that house prices have gone up dramatically since the 70s or the 80s to a point where they're unaffordable for pretty much anybody at the age of 40 or 45 or 50, which is ludicrous. And younger people have lost the ability to access housing to buy and find security of housing and security of tenure that way. They've also largely lost the ability to get a council house or social housing and get security of tenure that way. So what you have is millions and millions of people, the vast majority of younger people in this country, who are stuck in private rented accommodation, the rental cost goes up and up and up, and it's £2,500 a month. Think in London right now, it's less than that in the rest of the country, thank goodness. That's at the whim of the market. People are caught, and as we know, if people don't have security of tenure, they don't put down roots, they have fewer children, they don't get involved in the local activities, the local church, the local food bank, the local, whisk drive, whatever it is, people's lives are materially worse. Our communities are materially worse. Keir Starmer is saying, I will deal with it. And just to respond to the point on the environment earlier on, this is not an either-or of you build houses or you desecrate the environment. You can build houses and you don't desecrate the environment. What the Conservatives want to do is build houses close to watercourses and lots of runoff into the water. That will harm marine life in particular. There is a way to build houses in other places, and I think particularly opening up the green belt will enable that, because there's this huge swathe of land designated the green belt. Some of it's very beautiful, some of it really isn't and can be built upon.
I'm just speculating how many people on this panel have ever been to a whisk drive.
I have.
Can't say that I haven't. I don't know why that came to mind.
I used to go every year every week with my dad.
I just thought the constellation of community, church, food bank, whisk drive.
I bet you've been to a whisk drive. Have you not?
I never have, and I want. If you are going to one, I'd like you to
very quickly, Jake.
Well, I think that there's a fundamental question here, a fundamental problem, which is what sort of country do we want to be? We're in a position now where we've got record numbers of people out of work. 5.3 million, I think the figure is, with 1.1 million off sick. And there's a shortage of labour, particularly cheap labour. This is all post-COVID in particular, has been exacerbated by that. But it goes back much further than that. The way in which the government has been trying to fill that black hole is with immigration. And our population is expanding, not just because of immigration, but it's a big part of it, expanding rapidly. I mean, the immigration levels are at a level that would have made Tony Blair's eyes water back in the day. And so if you have that, if that's the country we want to be, if that's the decision that we want to take to move forward in that way, undoing it is very, very difficult, then we need to have somewhere for everybody to live. And at the moment, because we've got limited housing stock, it pushes house prices up and rent prices up and it hits young people. And so we are going to have to build proper housing, including new towns, if that's the way things are going. Now, Keir Starmer's target, 1.5 million new homes, is very ambitious. And I wonder if there isn't a reason why the Tories have failed to hit similar targets in the past, because it's a very, very difficult problem to solve.
Is it really that ambitious when, even under this government, I think it's 220 to 250,000 a year being built, and all he wants to do is put it up to 300,000? And why is that so ambitious?
Well, it's ambitious because he wants to go beyond that to 1.5 million. It doesn't just stop at that level.
Yeah, that's still only 300,000 a year. That was over a 5-year period.
Sure, but it is ambitious because at the moment the pressure is so intense on the public purse and on the public finances that we're not in the pre-financial crash days, we're not in the pre-COVID days, we're in a very different world with taxes at record levels and expenditure at record levels as well. So there's very little to play with.
Right, we'll move on to some more subjects in just a couple of minutes' time, and our legendary fun question at the end. It's 8:48.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
We have with us Jacqui Smith, Jake Wallis-Simons, Mike Buckley and Lord Daniel Moylan. Let's go to Nikki in Kent for an Alexa question. I was going to lend my vote to Labour, but no more because Brexit was not mentioned by Keir Starmer during his speech. Is it fraudulent to say the UK can do just as well outside the European Union? Is that what he said? I don't know. Mike?
I don't believe he said that, no. I mean, Labour is setting out now a very clear plan on Brexit, which I think everybody's very, very happy to see. And they're very clear that the deal that Boris Johnson put together is catastrophic for the UK. And that indeed is why I have a job, discovering all the ways in which it is catastrophic. And
it's not catastrophic for you then?
It's not for me, no. Granted, however, I do end up in lots of conversations discovering lots of awful things that are happening in other people's lives, so it's not always cheerful, if you see what I mean. So I think Labour's been very clear that a better deal is available. And
is it, though? That's the point that people say, well, they can say they want a better deal, but if the EU has no incentive to give a better deal, why would they?
They do have an incentive. They have an incentive because they believe in the European project. They have an incentive because even though we are in difficulty as compared to where we would have been had we never left in many, many ways, we're still a bigger country, but we've got a lot to offer. And the EU know we've got a lot to offer, primarily, of course, in security and defence, but also in areas like healthcare, in manufacturing, in car manufacturing, in environmental regulation. We've got lots to offer the EU, and they're fully aware of that. And they do also have a mindset, many of them, that they want to draw us back into the European project.
And of course that will be an attack line by the Conservatives on Keir Starmer, saying, well, if he goes down this road, it's just a sign that he eventually wants to rejoin the EU.
No, it's not. It's a sign that he's got ambition for this country, which the current government don't have. I mean, the problems created by the current Brexit deal are evident. The current government is refusing to address that. That makes all of us poorer. It makes all of our lives more difficult. That's a failure of governance. Keir Starmer, like with housing, is saying he'll step up to the plate.
Jake?
Well, I mean, the question really culminates in this idea of whether the UK can do just as well outside the EU as inside it. And underlying that is that the real scale of values as to whether you're doing well or not is financial and economic. I understand that. But I think a lot of Brexiteers feel there are other scales of value as well, including feeling like you're in control of your own destiny, sovereignty, and being an independent nation. And I think that's really, for me, where the question lies, whether we can, as a country, grip the idea of independence and sort out our own problems ourselves, or whether it will just be a disaster. And talking about immigration earlier, I think many Brexiteers are very surprised that they might have voted because they thought they were going to get lower immigration. And finally, we've got control back and it's gone up.
Well, they should have listened to me, shouldn't they? Because I said the exact opposite would happen, Jacqui.
I think what Nikki was wanting Keir Starmer to say was, we will rejoin the EU. Now, in an ideal world, I would like to rejoin the EU, but I absolutely know it's not going to happen. I respect the views of the British people, even if it appears from polls that they've now changed. But I accept the result of the referendum. I accept that the EU are unlikely to welcome us back with open arms anyway. So actually, the most sensible way to approach this now is the sort of work that Mike's doing and the pragmatic approach that Keir Starmer's taking to trying to get the best for Britain out of a series of ways in which we are able to negotiate better deals with the EU. That's the sensible and pragmatic place to be now.
Is it, Daniel?
No. Everything you want to get from the European Union, there is a price for it. And every part of that price means giving up a degree of sovereignty and control over your own affairs. And nobody in this country really wants to go back down that path. There's a few fanatics like Mike who are working on it, but really is a fanatic.
He doesn't strike me as a... I've never met him before, but he doesn't strike me as a fanatic.
There is a glint in his eye.
Your listeners couldn't see the glint in his eye the moment we got onto that question. Calm and rational up to that point, and then the glint in his eye. I cannot wait. I mean, Keir Starmer can waste his 5 years in office, if he gets elected, 5 years in office, doing things that people, on the whole, don't want to do, like messing around with the linings with Europe, reforming the House of Lords,
sharing real-time intelligence information so that we're a safer country, for example, something like that.
Giving votes to 16-year-olds, or he can focus on fixing some of the things. Nothing to do with Brexit, but there's a whole range of stuff that he's being drawn into, or he can focus on fixing the things people are interested in. I can't wait for the moment when Keir turns up, newly minted Prime Minister, turns up in Brussels, first flight, there's von der Leyen, all those people lined up in there, and he says, hello, Ursula, it's me, it's Keir, your old friend, your co-conspirator. Remember those great days when we were plotting against Brexit? What's the deal? What's the deal for Britain now I'm in charge? And he finds out it's exactly the same deal that was being offered to Rishi, and they're not really that interested. And either that'll be a wake-up moment for him, and he comes home and he realises his job is to run this country properly for the people of Britain, not give our sovereignty away to another power, or he'll just waste his what I suspect then will be a fairly brief period in office.
We could spend the rest of the programme talking about that, but I do want to get this last question in. It's a text question from Kate in Barnstaple. Judges are being told that prisons are full. Apparently rapists and burglars could be temporarily spared jail from next week. Do we send too many people to prison? Now, Lord Edis, the senior presiding judge for England and Wales, has ordered that sentencing of convicted criminals who are currently on bail should be delayed from Monday. Jake?
Well, prisons are the pinch point where problems that are underlying in society find their fullest expression, and we do have overcrowded prisons which have been like that for a very long time, with more people in cells than the cells were designed for, with Victorian estates, with really woeful conditions. But the difficulty is keeping the recidivism rates down if you're not going to use prisons in the way that we have been. There have been a lot of problems with the idea of people being incorporated into the community and serving their sentences in open prisons and that sort of thing. And I think that it's not really a vote winner. People want to be tough on justice and on crime and law and order. And if they hear a manifesto which says we're going to put less people in prison, fewer people in prison, it's not going to win any election. So I think that both parties are going to be talking tough in the run-up to the next election.
Daniel?
I'm out of sympathy with a lot of my natural supporters here. We are sending too many people to prison, but we are also, and this is really at the heart of it, sending people to prison for too long. The sentences have increased for serious crimes. The sentences get longer and longer and longer, and people demand longer sentences, and the judges are required to impose longer sentences. We're now talking sort of 30-year, 40-year type sentences are coming down in some cases, and they're doing no good whatsoever. I mean, you know, if you, in the days of hanging, if you were convicted of murder and you were reprieved, and a lot of people were reprieved, and you were given life sentence instead, back in the 40s and 50s, do you know how long you'd have served for murdering somebody? You'd been about 10 years in jail before they let you out. Now what we've got is, that's just an example. And now we have, you know, longer and longer sentences to no purpose whatsoever. We have the IPP scandal, which remains completely unresolved. That would take 3,000 people out of jail straight away.
We're really running out of time, Jacqui. Short answer.
Our criminal justice system is an utter mess. There are too many people in prison. They're not being rehabilitated. Cases are taking far too long to come to court. People are losing confidence that the criminal justice system is working to keep them safe, or even to properly progress people's cases if they are defendants. I'm doing jury service next week. I hope I'm not on the receiving end of that mess. But, you know, it is a
you might
shocking...
escape it.
Yeah, I might do. It is a shocking scandal and something that I think we need a Labour government to clear up.
Now to the fanatical Mike Buckley.
Well, I will agree with the fanatical Jacqui on this. The criminal justice system is in a mess. Yes, there are too many people in prison. Yes, potentially people are there for too long. Yes, people aren't being rehabilitated. But these are all subsets of a criminal justice system which, after 13 years of terrible government, is failing catastrophically.
Wasn't doing too well under the previous 13 years, I seem to remember, in some regards, but we'd better not get into that.
Oh, should we get into numbers of people in prison, rehabilitation rates, crime rates?
Final fun question from Sam in Hounslow. The Manchester tram line will now be voiced by Liam Gallagher. God, whatever next. If the tube needs a new voice, which politician or public figure should they get to record it? Jacqui?
Well, having spent an hour with you lot, it'd be good to have a woman's voice, so I'm going to go with Adele.
Right, OK. Daniel?
If you go to the wonderful headquarters that was built for the London Underground in 1920s at St James's Park Station, which Sadiq Khan has scandalously sold off to be a private hotel, and you look at the foundation stone, it says this foundation stone was laid by Mr. So-and-so, one of the housekeepers of London Underground. And that's the tradition of London Underground. Tradition of London Underground is to have its staff at the fore, and I think it should be the staff who are actually doing those announcements, recorded for maybe a year at a time, whatever. Just like we did those great portraits of all the staff about 5 or 6 years ago, 8 or 9 years ago, as a sort of project, an arts project. The staff should be at the heart of it, and we don't need celebs. The railway, the tube, is the star.
Mike?
Well, Boris Johnson needs a job, but I would suggest if you really want to cheer people up, you should get David Attenborough or Joanna Lumley on there.
Oh, Joanna Lumley, yeah, absolutely.
Improve everyone's journey.
I'm sold on that. Jake?
I would say Sir Keir Starmer, because he clearly thinks at the moment there is light at the end of the tunnel, unless his train goes off the rails.
And Jake will be appearing at a comedy club every Saturday. Thank you very much indeed to Jacqui Smith, Jake Wallis-Simons, Mike Buckley and Lord Moylan. Coming up in the next hour, a man has scaled Sheffield Town Hall to remove the Israeli flag as Jewish schools around the country step up security. How do we stop the conflict in the Middle East causing social strife here in the UK? Have you experienced this? We've heard from Jake in this hour that various examples of people that he knows who've been shouted at in the street, abused in some way or another. Are you worried?